Welcome. My name is Michael Lewin, and I'm running for Borough President. And as you probably know from looking at my other videos, the core of my campaign is the idea that we need to take a radical bite out of the zoning code so we can allow more housing to be built. So most of my videos address arguments against new housing. And so in particular, in this video, I'd like to address one of the more common arguments against new housing. That argument is essentially, we've already tried building housing, we've had a building boom, and instead of rents going down, they went up. So the core assumption of this argument is, well, if we build housing, that must have been enough to satisfy demand, that some housing is enough housing. So what's wrong with this assumption? What's wrong with this assumption is that some housing is not necessarily enough housing. If a city permits 1,000 apartments to be built, but 1 million jobs are created at the same time, obviously supply is not keeping up with demand. And so obviously demand is going to rise faster than supply in that situation, and rents will go up. So is this what happened in New York City? Let's look at the facts. First of all, if we'd really had a building boom, we would find that housing supply in New York City over the past decade or two had grown as rapidly as in the 1950s and 1960s. Is that true? In fact, it's not. Let's look at the record. In 1963, 60,000 new housing units were built. By contrast, in 2018, 27,000 units were built. Now, that's more than in earlier years in the 21st century. So maybe by the standards of New York City, that counts as a housing boom. But by the standards of New York City history, that's not very much at all. That's still far below 1960s levels. So the bottom line is, New York City actually allowed more housing in the mid-20th century than it did in recent decades. Another way to look at New York City's record is to compare New York City to other American cities. Now, if New York City had experienced a real building boom in the last decade or so, we would find that, in fact, more units in New York City were built than in other American cities. So, for example, we would find that in New York City, a higher percentage of units were built in the past decade or so than in, say, Raleigh or Tampa or Houston. But in fact, that's not the case. If you compare New York City to most fast-growing cities, like, for example, the examples in my PowerPoint I list, Dallas, Houston, Raleigh, Tampa, most of those cities, about 10 to 15% of housing was built after 2010. By contrast, in New York City, only 4% of housing was built after 2010. To put it another way, if you want to look at the raw number of units that were built and comparing it to population, New York City, between 2010 and 2018, New York City had about 16,000 new housing units per 1 million people. That is to say, we had about 140,000 units built between 2010 and 2018. And if you divide that by 8.5 million, that's roughly 16,000 per million. Actually, according to the 2020 census, our population is a little higher, 8.8 million, but I'm going to assume that some of that growth occurred in the last couple of years. By contrast, we look at Dallas, for example. Dallas has had 46,000 housing units per million people, almost 3 times as many as a percentage of its population in New York City. So by American standards, New York housing growth, in fact, has been kind of anemic. What about compared to job growth? That is to say, you might look at these other cities and you might say, well, yes, New York City's housing supply hasn't kept up with other cities, but New York is a slower growing city, so maybe the housing supply has kept up with demand. Well, let's look at the facts. In the 2010s, the number of jobs grew by about 900,000 people, or about 90,000 per year. By contrast, housing supply grew by about 20,000 people. So housing supply obviously has not kept up with demand. And that number actually underestimates demand because it overlooks people who chose not to create jobs or take jobs because of high housing costs. So I hope I've made my case. See you on the campaign trail.